want the witnesses and especially say how much in agreement we are on so many issues. And I guess, as Mr. Neal said at the outset, we missed a historic opportunity. Mr. Model, your stories, and Mr. Farr, with respect to manufacturing. During the Obama administration, President Obama started at 25%. That's where he came in for starters, before we started this. David Camp sat down with all of us, and we went through a 2-year process where we all sat down together and tried to reason about how we would come to this. That got totally abandoned. Mr. Farr, I agree with so much of what you had to say, except for one thing. You said we, and it wasn't we. Unfortunately, it was them. And they had their own agenda, and that's fine, that's history, it's over. But here's the impacts of these unintended or maybe intended consequences. Residents of the state of Connecticut, we're double taxed because of this process. Residents of my state, because they're no longer able to make state and local tax deductions, find themselves in a situation where they'll actually be paying more. They'll be paying more, as Mr. Ratner pointed out, because unfortunately we see this no tax reform, but tax redistribution that goes from the working members of people in my state paying for benefits that many of them in a high manufacturing state are very much in favor of. But they didn't anticipate is that they would be carrying the lion's share of the burden and paying for it. I was at a town hall meeting just the other day and asked homeowners to raise their hand if they itemized their deductions. Virtually every hand in the room went up. Those are the individuals, hardly wealthy by any stretch of the imagination, that are paying for this tax cut. And the other side wonders why we object and why we protest. And so for 41% of all Connecticut taxpayers itemize their deduction. That's 750,000 people. The average SALT deduction in Connecticut is nearly $20,000. This bill limits them to $10,000. Don't take it from me, though. Take it from states in the Northeast and California as well. It was Mr. Zeldin, a Republican from New York, who said, on balance, this bill remains a geographic redistribution of wealth, taking extra money from a place like New York to pay for deeper tax cuts elsewhere. New York is a net contributor, as is Connecticut, that now will be contributing even more. This bill chooses winners and losers in a way that could have been and should have been avoided. Mr. Ratner, do you believe that? Do you believe that there are winners and losers in this bill?
Well, Congressman, there are winners and losers in every bill, by definition. I think the job that Congress hopefully tries to do is to balance the equities so that there's some level of fairness in that. I pointed out that in this bill, one of the things that troubles me is that when you look just simply at the individual tax reduction, let's put all the business stuff aside for a minute, when you look simply at what was done to individual rates, and actually let's put aside the SALT problem for a moment. Let's just look at a taxpayer who doesn't have that issue. This is a regressive tax cut. In other words, the people at the upper income got a larger percentage tax cut than the people at the bottom of the income chain. And that is both contrary, I think, to the tradition of tax reform, as well as what's needed at this moment when we have massive income inequality in our country and where people at the bottom are suffering.
I agree with you, and I think Mr. Farr did when he said, well, yeah, no, this wasn't a perfect bill. But it sets up another whole discussion, this whole notion of a balanced budget amendment, and everybody's now concerned about the debt. But what we hear in terms of this debt is that, whoa, what we need is entitlement reform. Let me ask all of you, is Social Security an entitlement, or is it the insurance that people pay for under FICA? Mr. Holtzman?
It's an entitlement.
It's an entitlement.
I believe it's an insurance payment.
I believe it's an entitlement.
I believe it's an entitlement, but it should be on sound fiscal basis.
It's an insurance plan that people deduct daily. FICA, under my pay stub, is the federal insurance contribution. Who's the people of the United States make that contribution their own on a regular basis? The fact that it may not be actuarially sound is this government's fault, not the individuals. It doesn't make it an entitlement that should be cut. It's the insurance people paid for.
Thank you.
And
The
long
gentleman's
overdue that
time
this Congress
has
stood up or
expired.
even had a hearing on it
And
in this
Mr. Chairman,
committee.
can I respond to
Larson.
our friend from Mr. Connecticut, please?
Not at this time, Mr. Farr. The time has expired.